Recording going. Perfect. All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome. I'll treat this just like we did last week. So feel free again, unmute yourself if you have any questions or anything. Throw it out. Don't worry about it. There aren't that many of us that I'm worried about interruptions anyway. Today we're gonna finish up with the semester. This is our last class session. We'll go through the week 14 in class activity today. That's how we'll sort of end the semester with. Your final exam is going to be next week for you all. It will be on Tuesday. You'll have the whole day as your window to do it within. And the exam should be about, for you all, about probably 40 minutes. For you, the final exam is going to cover chapter 6 in the textbook, which was the appeal to authority arguments. And we're going to talk about today, the chapter 14, the chapter 11 stuff, rather, which is the various kinds of biases that impact inquiry. There also might be one or two questions, short little ones, about some of the stuff in the statistical inductive argument videos. So make sure you go back and you actually do watch the videos for the week 13 module, even though there won't be any big questions on it or whatever, just giving you a little bit of background on it. There might be a little bit of stuff on the exam. Anyone have any questions or anything about what's going to be on the exam or any of end of the semester stuff?
Wait, so what is going to be on the exam?
Yeah, so the exam will be the appeals to authority arguments that were in chapter 6, and it'll be the biases stuff that we're going to talk about today from chapter 11. That'll be pretty much what's on the exam. You might need to know some of like the logical fallacy stuff from earlier in the semester to do some of the questions, and we'll see today how they sort of come in with the material we're going to talk about today. But that's what's going to be on the final.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Any others? All right, then we're gonna I'll probably make one more video this week. I'll probably post it on Wednesday or so. It'll just be a little end of the semester video where I talk a little bit more about the final, wrap up the semester a little bit, but that'll be pretty much it for the semester. And the reason I wanted us to end the semester with chapter 11 is actually because it'll sort of be helpful, sort of almost full circle. We began the semester talking about this idea of inquiry, this idea that there's this sort of activity that we as humans can engage in. We all take ourselves to be rational. We all take ourselves to have good reasons for the things that we believe. And we can sort of put that to the test by engaging in this sort of activity where we just try to figure out what's true, try to figure out what are our reasons for what we believe. Are they good reasons? Are they bad reasons? And we were calling this sort of inquiry, this sort of almost idealistic practice where you don't care about anything other than truth and you only are concerned with truth. And so most of the semester, we've spent sort of figuring out how you could carry out such an activity. We focused on mainly sort of logical things that could go wrong, that could cause you to sort of form your beliefs for bad reasons, logical fallacies predominantly. But we noted right at the beginning of the semester that this way of talking, this is an idealized way of talking. There's all kinds of people who straightforwardly don't care about whether or not what they're saying is true or false at all. Right? The reason they're saying things is rather because they're trying to manipulate you, maybe. They're trying to get something out of you. They're trying to deceive you in some way. And so we could call maybe bad faith actors, right? People who sort of really don't care about truth and falsehood. But we also discussed that there's, people can, despite their best efforts, be trying to engage in inquiry seriously, and it can just go wrong. I mean, you see this all the time. You turn on Twitter, turn on Facebook, turn on the news, whatever, right? You're going to see kind of people who maybe are even for good faith reasons trying to figure out what's true and them not doing it very well. And a purely logical evaluation of that's going to just not fully exhaust it. I mean, we saw with a lot of logical fallacies, and we'll talk about this again today. A lot of them are so obviously wrong that it's kind of like hard to see why anyone would ever be persuaded by them. It's because there's usually something more than just a logical mistake going on. And that's what we're going to take from chapter 11. That's why chapter 11 will be a great way to end the semester. There's usually other things at play, what we're going to call sort of various kinds of biases at play in sort of how human brains work, basically, that can interfere with inquiry if left unchecked, and that frequently lead actually directly into logical fallacies. So what we're going to do today, we'll go through the week 14 in-class activity. There's a whole list of these various sorts of biases. If you go to the week 14 post-class activities in the module, you'll actually find two handouts. One of them is a list of all the biases, and one of them is a list of all the logical fallacies. So maybe that could help you with your studying. What we're going to do today is two kinds of questions. First, we're just going to start to recognize these biases when we see them. So unless anyone has any initial questions before I jump in, let's just start there. Anyone has questions? All right. Again, remember, feel free to send me a question on the chat, but it'll take me longer. You can also just unmute yourself if you run into any questions in the course of working on these problems. All right. So we have our list of sort of biases from the book. These are various features of how our brains work. In fact, the psychological ones are sort of features of basically sort of our emotional states. Social biases are features of how groups function together, and cognitive biases are basically how our brains process information. And these things are not in and of themselves bad. I mean, in many cases, there's actually real usefulness and value to some of the things we're going to talk about. When they become bad and dangerous, though, is if they sort of, in various kinds of ways, hinder an inquiry. So let's start with number one. We'll just work on this one together first, and then I'll give you a chance to work on the other ones individually before we talk about them. So this argument here, the belief in the existence of God is plainly irrational. There are numerous arguments that can be made to prove that God does not exist, given by notable philosophers and physicists. What do those who believe in God have to offer us? Just blind faith. All right, and if you wanted to interpret this as a sort of logical mistake or a logical fallacy, you could easily do that. You could read this argument as committing the straw person fallacy. Because I can tell you this firsthand. I teach medieval philosophy. I teach philosophy of religion. There are sure notable philosophers and physicists who argue that God does not exist, but I can also give you plenty of notable philosophers, physicists, theologians who argue that God does exist, and that indeed, therefore, it is therefore rational to believe in God because the argument suggests that God exists. Right? And so the reasons people have for believing in God is being misrepresented by the argument. At least in many cases, it is not just blind faith. But more is going on here than just that logical fallacy, right? Why is the fallacy being committed? Here, we see also demonstrated in this exchange an example of what gets called the my side bias. And so for these problems, you basically identify the bias and you give one or two sentences where you sort of explain why the bias is being committed. You can think of this a little bit like how you talked about some of the fallacies. So let's just first define the my side bias. The my side bias is our tendency to not be aware of why people who disagree with us believe what they believe. And this makes sense, right? I mean, let's say the person in this argument is presumably an atheist or an agnostic. Why are they an atheist or an agnostic? Well, probably a big part of it is they encountered these various arguments that to them were really compelling and established that to them God did not exist. And so, if they had heard a bunch of arguments proving that God did exist, maybe they wouldn't have come to the same conclusion. So it makes sense that we don't know why people come to opposite conclusions. What makes this dangerous, though, is that as a result, we tend to assume that those who disagree with us are just being irrational. When in fact, it's just we don't know what their reasons are for their beliefs. But our tendency to sort of interpret that ignorance as a kind of critique of the other person, that is the danger posed by the my side bias. And that's very clearly what we see at play here, right? The speaker is just not aware of various arguments that establish that God does exist or purport to prove that God does exist. And so they just assume that it's, blind faith, right? So blind, in this case, blind would almost mean like faith without reasons, right? And indeed, yeah, that's just ignoring a large percentage of the reasons people have for why they do believe in God. So this would be, and this might even be more than maybe you would even need to write an exam, but something like this is how I'd like you to go about approaching these arguments. Identify the bias, give a brief kind of account of what the bias means and why is it being committed here and how is it sort of dangerous to the inquiry. So pause for a second. Does anyone have any questions, comments, thoughts about this first question? All right, great. Now, why don't you turn to number 2? Look at number 2 on your own for a minute or two, and then we'll talk about it together. All right, so here's another problem that, again, we couldn't, if we wanted to, interpret this as logical fallacy. We could see this as the anecdotal evidence fallacy. You could kind of read this as a kind of generalization, right? That like poverty, the conclusion is something like poverty in general doesn't keep people from being successful. Why? Because I was successful, right? I was poor and I was successful. And so kind of an anecdotal evidence fallacy, treating their own experiences and giving too much evidentiary weight to those experiences. You could read the argument that way, that's fine. But again, more is going on than just that logical fallacy that kind of explains why the mistake is getting made. Here we see I have an example of what's called the cognitive bias of representativeness. Right. And this bias effectively consists in our tendency to assume that other people's experiences more or less match up with our own. And in and of itself, this is actually frequently quite useful. I mean, if I touch something and it's really, really hot and hurts my hand, and I say, hey, don't touch it, it'll hurt, you'll get hurt. The reason I do that is because I'm assuming you'll have the same experience when you touch the thing that I had. So in and of itself, this isn't a bad thing. Where it becomes bad or where it becomes dangerous is where this tendency causes us to reject other people's experiences if their experiences are really different from ours. And again, that's what we see taking place here. There are presumably people who have had very different experiences with poverty, and our speaker in this case is just not even considering the possibility that anyone could have such an experience. And so as a result of this, right, what's the danger here? The danger is that the speaker is going to dismiss a lot of perfectly good evidence, a lot of other people's experiences, just because it doesn't agree with their experience. And that's going to hinder the inquiry. That's going to cause perfectly good evidence to be rejected and perfectly good evidence to maybe even be ignored. Whereas over privileging evidence, it just confirms what it is that sort of one individual person has already experienced. All right. So how are people feeling? Everyone okay here with number 2? Any questions, thoughts, comments? Also, if anyone has a different bias they thought was at play, feel free to volunteer that as well. We can take a look at it. There's frequently are more than one ways of characterizing some of these arguments. So anyone have anything to say for number 2? All right, great. Let's move on to number 3 then.
Wait, I'm sorry. I have a question.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Let's go back. Yeah. I can't actually
I
give
was
facts.
just wondering. Okay. I was just wondering, like, why is it not, or would it be like the availability bias one? Like, is that one not applicable here?
I could see. So okay, so we'll talk. We'll look at an example of that one a little bit later on. But it's okay here. So I imagine like what you'd be saying is that like their sort of their experiences of their own as being poor were like really like vivid to them in some way. Is that sort of the idea of why you would think that one was relevant in that in number two?
I was thinking more about the availability, like their experience is more readily available to them in their
Oh,
mind.
than
But
other
if it's
people's.
more focused on the vividness, then like, yeah, that makes sense why it wouldn't be applicable.
Yeah, the availability of both the availability and the vividness are sort of like within your own individual experiences. So like some memories are
Right.
easier for us to recall; they're more available to us, and some are more vivid; they're easier for us to recall for that reason. So does that help?
Okay.
How
Yeah, that makes
representative
sense.
is more other people, availability and vividness is more within me.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Awesome, great. All right, so let's start talking about number three now. So this was actually an exchange I heard on a podcast I was listening to. Actually, one of the very first generation of women editors in a newspaper was giving this interview. And in the course of it, she was talking about how she thought it was really important that women dress a certain way in the workforce. She thought that was sort of an important part that that maybe younger people weren't doing as much or something, and she was sort of bothered by it. And so, okay, you could, I guess, you could maybe characterize it as a kind of logical fallacy. Maybe this would be the fallacy of popularity, where you assume that something is good just because lots of people do it. Fine, that you could again read it that way. But okay, but why is that fallacy taking place? Here we have an example of one of the social biases called inside the box thinking. This is a dynamic of how groups work and how human beings sort of relate to the groups that they're part of. So inside the box thinking is where is sort of our tendency to treat the traditions and customs that are part of some group as if they were sort of necessary or they were unchanging or they're basically just not customs or traditions, to sort of forget that we're the reason why those things exist. And why is this dangerous? Well, it simply causes people to be reluctant to investigate certain kinds of things that, at least in principle, are objects of inquiry. When we talk about a group, we can mean any sort of size of group. It can be as sort of intimate as maybe if you celebrated Thanksgiving with your family. I'm sure you had various kinds of traditions or customs that your family followed. That would be an example of a group. But we also could talk about a workplace, right? As a kind of group, and workplaces too have their customs, their traditions, their sort of the way that things get done. And here, what we see is a sort of just almost a person who's just not willing to really investigate or give evidence or reasons to justify why these customs are the right ones to have. And you see that in part just because of the way in which, like, that's just how it is. Whenever anyone says that's how it is, usually it doesn't have to be that way, though. And that's what's getting overlooked. Customs and traditions are things that in principle can be changed. And so if you're not willing to sort of recognize that possibility, this is sort of inside the box thinking. You can't get outside sort of the confines or the traditions and customs that sort of define the groups that you're a part of. All right. How's everyone feeling with number 3? Any questions, thoughts, comments here? All right, then let's keep moving on. Let's go to number 4. All right. So here, it'd be hard to even characterize this one as a fallacy. This is just the inquiry never even gets started, almost for it to fall into a logical error. What's going on here? We see the defensiveness bias. The defensiveness bias is where a person interprets some sort of criticism of their position or a belief they have or a conclusion that they've come to as a kind of personal attack. And the important thing is here, even when they're actually not. And why is this a bad thing? It changes the actual focus of the inquiry away from the topic to the person who's people who are involved in the inquiry. And therefore, the inquiry is not going to work. The inquiry is not going to go. We actually have to be talking about the topic, not us, if we're going to inquire about something together. And that's very much what we see here. Person A is critiquing a conclusion reached in a paper. But person B interprets this as a kind of personal attack and actually shifts the topic away from actually what was discussed in the paper. Right. And so therefore, keeps the inquiry from even really beginning, right? They don't, for example, say, I disagree, I think I did provide enough evidence or something like that. It's something we can talk about. They shifted it to something kind of irrelevant. Right, how are people doing with number 4? Any questions? All right, then let's go to number 5. All right. So here we see another psychological bias. This is a good example of it that's called ideological fixity. You could also maybe call this desire for certainty. It's not quite as strong, but I'll talk about that option at the end. I think ideological fixity is a little bit clearer. All right, so ideological fixity is our tendency to adopt certain frameworks. That's what I mean by an ideology. An ideology is basically just a kind of framework that we use to interpret the world. Now, again, in and of itself, that's not necessarily a bad thing. These frameworks are quite helpful in a lot of ways, that we rely upon them all the time to help navigate the world in certain ways, to figure out what's going on, what's important, how can we respond to some circumstance. I mean, it's sort of weird to think of it like this, but like when I'm sick, I should go to a doctor. That's kind of like an ideology. It's a framework for interpreting the world. When ideologies become dangerous is when we, in a sense, forget that they are themselves things that need to be justified. An ideology is itself something that could be a subject for an inquiry. When ideologies become dangerous is when they become sort of ready-made things that you can use in any circumstance to know the answer to any question before the question even gets asked in the first place. You know the answer before the question even gets asked. And that's where ideology becomes dangerous, because again, it's if you think you know the answer, you're not even going to ask the question. You see this all the time on things like maybe like, cable news personalities or whatever. You don't need to name names or anything, but a lot of them, right? You turn in and you already know what they're going to say before you even have watched the show, because they always say the same thing. They always apply the same kind of analysis to whatever the news story of the day is going to be. The actual specifics of the news story of the day isn't going to change really anything that they're going to say. They're always going to apply the exact same ideological framework. And so therefore, they're not going to investigate anything, right? Whereas one of the things that you might want to know, and this is very clear in this case, is why is this ideology or this framework the right one to apply for this specific case? And that's what person B fails to do. You could say in this case, person B has sort of like a hawkish foreign policy as a kind of ideology, right? And they're not justifying why that ideological framework is the right one to deal with this specific crisis. And so they might look as if they're inquiring, but they're really not. To inquire, you actually have to have a real question. They're not actually letting the question of what should we do even emerge as a question. All right, how people doing here? Any thoughts, questions, comments? Number 5. You could also maybe call this a desire for certainty. You could say desire for certainty is basically our tendency to want things to be settled, to not like when things become uncertain. And you could say that maybe here they sort of want this question of how to respond to foreign policy. It's kind of like they need that situation to have been settled for themselves in some sense. That's fine. I almost feel like ideological fixity explains the precise way that that's happening here a little bit more clearly. That's happening through the desire for certainty is manifesting as the application of a kind of settled ideology. Any questions, thoughts here? All right, then let's jump to number 6. Number 6 will be the last of these first kinds of questions where your only job is just to sort of identify, in a sense, what bias is present. So let's look at number 6 now. All right. So here we see the cognitive bias of overconfidence. All right. So this bias is our tendency to either, so two options for this. One, to be more confident that a belief is true than is actually justified by the evidence. Or the other version of it is to adopt a more extreme version of some belief than is actually supported by the evidence. And it's the second one that we see at play here, right? Person A hears this study, then what would be a reasonable belief to adopt on the basis of the study? Probably at most that a person shouldn't drink too much coffee. Maybe some people should drink a little bit less. And again, we're talking a lot here, 8 cups a day, right? So if maybe people at that high of levels, maybe they should drink a little bit less coffee if they have other risk factors, maybe for stomach cancer too, something like that. That's a sort of a moderate belief. Person A, however, interprets that into a far more extreme belief that coffee is dangerous and will kill you. And that belief just is not actually supported by the evidence. It's too extreme, right? Where the actual belief should be don't drink too much coffee if you have certain risk factors, becomes coffee is deadly and you will die from it. Right? And that's just literally an overconfident belief. The reason we have this tendency, the reason our brains work like this, is that when we're acting, action actually does have to be all or nothing. So if there's a cup of coffee in front of you, you either have to drink the coffee or not drink it, right? And again, you maybe drink half of it or whatever, but even still, you're either going to drink some of the coffee or you're not going to drink it, right? That's sort of all or nothing. So you sort of have to be extreme in your actions. But we don't have to be so extreme in our beliefs. Right? We can not drink a cup of coffee without adopting the extreme belief that every cup of coffee is dangerous. Maybe we can adopt a more moderate belief to justify a sort of all or nothing kind of action. All right. So that's the last of these first kinds of problems that are going to be on the exam. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts, or comments on number 6? All right, so there'll be a bunch of questions on the exam that look pretty much just like these, where I think there'll be 3 of them. The exam is almost finished being written. There'll be 3 of these questions, I believe, where your task is pretty much identify what the bias is, and then 1 or 2 sentences, maybe even a little less than I wrote in some of those cases, explain why that bias is actually present within the argument. There's going to be another set of problems, though, that are going to be a little bit longer and a little bit harder, where your task is going to be to sort of combine this discussion of the biases with the discussion of logical fallacies that we've been doing throughout the semester. As I tried to show in a few cases, like in the first 3 problems, frequently these biases are going to go together with logical fallacies. Both are going to be present. And so for another kind of problem that I'm going to give you on the exam, you're going to have 3 tasks in effect. First, you need to identify what logical fallacy is present in some argument. Second, identify what bias is sort of leading to that fallacy. And then the third thing I'm going to want you to do is come up with some kind of response to the fallacy that also responds to and addresses the underlying bias. So this is getting us closer to sort of real world examples of us trying to do logic and be better thinkers logically. Usually you all probably have some experience with this, even if it's just within yourselves. Just pointing out to someone like, hey, that's the slippery slope fallacy, hardy, hardy, har. That's not going to get a great reaction. People are going to be like, oh, I've changed my mind. Thank you for pointing out my logical mistake to me, right? That's not usually how people work. Why? Because more is going on when a logical mistake gets made than just a logical mistake in many cases, at least. And so a real response, if you want to really respond to something that you see as sort of a logical mistake in someone else, you usually have to do more than just respond to the logic of it. And that's what I would like us to practice in these next 3 questions. So let's look at number 7. Maybe take a quick minute, look at number 7. At least try to identify the fallacy and the bias that is present within it, and then we'll talk about it together. All right, so what logical fallacy do we see here? Well, we see the slippery slope fallacy. It's really unlikely that taking care of a child when they're crying is going to lead to that child ending up in jail. And the argument doesn't do anything to establish any kind of likelihood, right? It just asserts that one thing will follow from another without really justifying in any sort of logical terms how we're going to get from A to B. Okay, so fine. And again, you could point that out, but indeed, in this case, we see more is going on. Why is this logical fallacy getting committed? We seem to have an example of the availability and vividness bias. Right? It seems as if our speaker has a very powerful, painful memory. Of their brother getting spoiled as a child and their brother ending up in jail. And that is almost why this sort of irrational link is being drawn, right? Because it's sort of the undue weight that this sort of bad memory or these bad memories are having in terms of what they're accepting as legitimate evidence or as, acceptable kinds of evidence. And so, again, you could just point out the logical fallacy, but that's not going to get to the fundamental reason why the mistake is getting made in the first place. And so a more sophisticated response is going to have to hit sort of both sides of it. So in terms of what kind of response to write, there's lots of different things you can come up with. You wouldn't necessarily have to write the one that I'm writing here. This is just an example of the kind of thing you could put down. But maybe you could say something like this. So I know, your experience with your brother when you were young was really painful. And I agree, it's important that we not spoil our child. But taking care of a crying infant's not the same thing as spoiling a child. And is very unlikely to lead to, the same fate your brother suffered. So in this response, we do actually address the logical fallacy. It's basically the second half is basically just saying, yeah, that's not really likely to follow, actually. But it's sort of being framed in terms of acknowledging the painful experience that people have had in the past, taking it seriously, maybe even granting what's legitimate in the worry, but not letting that one vivid experience have undue evidentiary weight and trying to encourage people off of it to look at other kinds of evidence too, right? So it responds both to the fallacy and the bias that sort of produced the fallacy in the first place. That's what I'll be looking from you all when you're doing these. Sort of hit it, that your response hits both sides of why the fallacy is getting proposed. So does anyone have any questions with number 7? All right, then why don't you try a few minutes work on number 8 and do all of this on your own. All right, so here we have the red herring fallacy. The how good the customer service is or the quality of the products is just sort of irrelevant to the question of whether or not the employees should get raises. And so it's therefore just a distraction tactic. And okay, yeah. So why is this distraction tactic being employed? And in some cases, maybe it's being deployed deliberately or strategically, right? Maybe some boss is just trying to manipulate their employees into going along with something unfair. But here, it seems like something additional is going on. I sort of think of this example as, if any of you are fans of The Office, this is sort of like the Michael Scott example for me, right? Where what do we also seems to be going on here? We also seem to have the psychological bias of identification with beliefs. The manager, it seems to be really important to the manager that people think that he's a good manager and think that the company is a good company. And he's reluctant to look at things that challenge that. Right? Unwilling to sort of reluctant to sort of like put his own self-identity into question. And that would then lead him to bring up a whole bunch of irrelevant things, right? A whole bunch of things that don't matter, but they're things that indeed, confirm the sense he has of himself that he's a good manager working for a good company, something like that. And so, what kind of response could we give here? Maybe something like this, if the company is as good as you say that it is. Shouldn't us employees receive raises in recognition of our good work? Again, we sort of hit both sides, right? We shift the conversation away from the irrelevant details that are brought up in the red herring, right? So we're now back to the question of raises, right? And we're also sort of trying to encourage the manager to move beyond his sort of preconceived notion of himself to sort of notice or recognize the cognitive dissonance that really should emerge between how he sort of sees himself and what the situation suggests about the actual company itself. All right, any questions, thoughts, comments for number 8? All right, then let's do one last question. Let's look at number 9. All right. So here we see the post hoc fallacy. We have a superstitious kind of belief this person has that animals are the cause of their misfortune. Characterize it. No, there's no reason to believe that the bird flying by caused the computer to crash. Besides the fact that it came first. And it isn't, and that's not even a credible cause. All right. And okay, why is this happening in this case? Why does the person have this sort of superstitious belief? Well, we're told it's a kind of what's called confirmation bias. That the person only really is remembering encounters they have with animals that confirm the hypothesis that they already had. The confirmation bias, think of it as basically our tendency to only want evidence that confirms what it is we already believe. And so to sort of only look for evidence that accepts what we already believe, and to be suspicious or dismissive of evidence that doesn't confirm it. And so here, there's sort of the person A is only looking for evidence that confirms this hypothesis that animals are in some sense unlucky to them. And so to respond to the post hoc fallacy, we're also going to have to try to undermine the occurrence of the confirmation bias. So maybe something like this could do it. Right. And so a response like this, right? I'm sure you've had plenty of experiences with animals that weren't unlucky, and maybe if you actually know the person, maybe you could list them. Right, and those cases were probably just coincidences, just like happened in this case, right? Again, we're sort of hitting both sides. This last part, right? It's just a coincidence. That's hitting the post hoc fallacy side. Right, pointing out that there's not really much of a strong causal evidence to justify the conclusion that the animal is the cause of the bad luck, but also trying to encourage people to sort of challenge the confirmation bias to look at evidence that they already have access to that doesn't confirm the sort of superstitious hypothesis, in an effort to try to get them outside of that pattern of thinking. Any questions on number 9? All right, so that'll do it for the semester, really. At least for us meeting face to face. I'll have office hours like normal the rest of this week. I want to thank you all very much for the hard work you've put in during this semester. This has been a crazy, frustrating, bad semester in a lot of different ways. A weird one, if nothing else. And so I thank you all for hanging in there as best as we can. It looks like, from what I can tell now at least, that the spring semester is going to use a lot of similar kinds of things that we had to do this semester. So I'd really, really value it if any of you can fill out the course surveys for the semester. I always value them, but I value it even more this semester. I've never really taught any of these sort of hybrid structure classes before. And I'm going to have to teach another logic class in the exact same way next semester. So if you could fill it out for me, let me know what worked, what didn't work, how I could change things to sort of better fit your needs. That would all be really valuable, really helpful feedback for me as I'm getting ready to do this all again next semester, and hopefully just for next semester. I'm hoping by the fall things will be more or less back to normal for all of us. So again, thank you all very much. I'll have one more video that I post on Wednesday or so, just sort of ending up the semester, talking a little bit more about the final and all of that. Until that point and beyond, thank you all very much for all your work. I hope you found the semester valuable, and I will talk to you all later. Feel free, if anyone wants to chat for a minute, I can stick around for a real quick minute.
Hey, thank you so much for a great semester.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too. Happy-
I appreciate your great semester. Have good luck next time.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you both, to all of you as well. Yeah, this has been crazy.
Have a good winter break.
You too.